A customs officer breaks the wax seal on a leather scroll case pulled from the hold of a merchant ship docked at Alexandria, unrolls a few inches of papyrus by lamplight, and calls over a palace scribe before the ship's own captain can object. This is routine. Every vessel that puts in at this harbour can be searched, and anything worth reading can be kept, copied, and its owner handed back a copy instead of the original, whether he likes it or not. It is the price of doing business in the one city on earth built, by royal decree, to hold every book that exists. For roughly 6 centuries, the Library of Alexandria will grow into the greatest concentration of written knowledge the ancient world ever assembled, and the scholars who work inside it will measure the earth, map the stars, dissect the body, and edit the poems everyone quotes but almost no one has read correctly. Then, slowly, and for reasons far messier than a single dramatic fire, it will come apart. This is the story of how it was built, who kept its lamps lit, and how, piece by piece, they went out. Surveyors are driving stakes into a strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and a shallow lake west of the Nile Delta, laying out streets on a grid wider and straighter than anything in the older cities of Egypt. It is 331 BC, and the man who ordered this city built, Alexander of Macedon, will never live to see it finished. He is already marching east toward Persia, and within 8 years he will be dead in Babylon at the age of 32, leaving behind an empire with no clear heir and a half-dozen generals, each convinced he deserves the largest piece of it. One of those generals, a Macedonian named Ptolemy, makes a decision that will shape everything that follows. Rather than chase the dream of holding the whole empire together, he takes Egypt, and he takes it seriously. He seizes Alexander's funeral procession on its way west, redirects the embalmed body to his new capital, and builds a tomb for it there, turning Alexandria overnight into a place with a claim to Alexander's own legacy that no rival city can match. Ptolemy crowns himself king around 305 BC, the first of a dynasty that will rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and he wants his capital to be more than a well-placed harbour town. He wants it to be the intellectual centre of the world Alexander conquered, and he has the money, the Egyptian grain surplus, and the shipping lanes to attempt it. Into this ambition walks an exiled Athenian statesman named Demetrius of Phalerum, who once governed Athens itself before being driven out by a rival faction, and who now offers Ptolemy something no general or engineer can, a plan modelled loosely on the private research circle Aristotle had run in Athens a generation earlier for an institution unlike anything a king had built before. Not a temple to a god in the ordinary sense, though it would carry a god's name, and not a school for a single teacher's students, but a permanent royally funded community of scholars given housing, meals, and freedom from taxes in exchange for one obligation: think, measure, write, and argue, for the glory of the king who pays for it. Demetrius calls the plan the Maution, a shrine to the 9 muses, the patron goddesses of poetry, music, and the arts and sciences broadly understood in the Greek world of the period. Attached to it, in a design that will take shape over the following decades under Ptolemy and his son, will be a building for the books themselves, so that the scholars gathered there have not just each other to argue with, but every text anyone can lay hands on. It is an audacious idea for its time. No king before Ptolemy had tried to make the accumulation of knowledge itself a matter of state prestige, on the same level as a fleet or a temple complex, and no city before Alexandria had the combination of new money, new land, and a founding myth flexible enough to support the claim that it was now the centre of the intellectual world, rather than merely a trading post on the Egyptian coast. Ptolemy is old by the standards of his era, having served for decades under Alexander and Philip before him, and he will not personally see this project through to completion. What he does before his death around 283 BC is set the terms. Alexandria will be a city that collects, and the collecting will not stop at the harbour gate. A young scholar arrives at the palace quarter of Alexandria carrying a single travel case of scrolls, is shown to a private room he did not have to pay for, and is told his meals will be provided in a communal dining hall alongside men he has read about but never met. This is the deal Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who succeeds his father around 283 BC, offers to anyone whose reputation for learning reaches his court. Come to Alexandria, and the king will feed you, house you, and exempt you from taxation, in exchange for nothing more specific than your presence and your work. It is Ptolemy II who turns his father's plan from an ambition into an institution with real walls and a real budget. The Maution complex grows to include lecture halls, covered walkways for discussion, a dining hall for the resident scholars, and gardens where, by later accounts, some of them kept animals and plants for study, an early forerunner of a research menagerie. Attached to it is the building history remembers simply as the library, a structure whose exact floor plan no surviving source describes in full detail, though ancient writers agree it held an enormous quantity of papyrus scrolls organized for scholars to consult, copy, and argue over. The numbers later ancient writers give for how many scrolls the library eventually held vary wildly, from the low hundreds of thousands into the high hundreds of thousands, and modern historians treat every specific figure with caution, since no contemporary catalogue of the whole collection survives and ancient authors were prone to inflating numbers for effect. What is not in serious dispute is the ambition behind the number. This was meant to be, and by most accounts functioned as, the largest concentrated collection of written texts anywhere in the Mediterranean world, drawing together Greek philosophy and drama, Egyptian religious and administrative texts, and works translated from Persian, Babylonian, and other traditions the Ptolemaic court had access to. Ptolemy II staffs this project with the leading intellectuals of his generation, luring them from Athens, Rhodes, and elsewhere with royal patronage that no city-state could match, since no city-state had a treasury built on Egypt's grain exports and control of the eastern Mediterranean's busiest shipping lanes. The scholars who take up residence are not merely custodians of the books. Their job, as the Ptolemaic court understands it, is to produce new knowledge using the collection as raw material, to edit unreliable manuscripts of Homer into a single trustworthy text, to write commentaries explaining obscure vocabulary and mythological references, to compose original poetry and drama in styles that draw on the whole Greek literary tradition now sitting on shelves a short walk from their quarters, and eventually, as the institution matures, to pursue mathematics, astronomy, geography, and medicine with the same royal backing. Ptolemy II's own household reflects this priority. He commissions, according to later tradition, a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures for the substantial Jewish community of Alexandria, a project that will become known as the Septuagint. He funds construction of the Pharos, the great lighthouse marking Alexandria's harbour entrance, and counted among the wonders of the ancient world, less for its role in scholarship than as another marker that this city intends to be looked at, admired, and imitated. Under his reign, the practice of searching incoming ships for text worth copying, an informal habit under his father, hardens into policy, and Alexandria's harbour becomes not just a customs point for cargo, but a filter through which the written knowledge of the wider Mediterranean world passes on its way toward being catalogued, copied, and shelved. By the time Ptolemy II dies in 246 BC, the library and its attached mountain are no longer merely his father's idea. They are Alexandria's identity, and the next generation of Ptolemaic kings will inherit both the institution and the expectation that they keep feeding it. A ship's captain stands on the quay at Alexandria arguing with a royal official over a case of scrolls just carried off his vessel, and by most accounts he is not going to win this argument. Ancient sources, admittedly written well after the events they describe and not always reliable in their specifics, report that under the early Ptolemies it became standard practice for any book found aboard a ship docking at Alexandria to be seized, copied by scribes working for the library, and only sometimes returned to its original owner, with a copy substituted for the original if the librarians judged the original text more valuable to keep. Historians today treat the exact mechanics of this policy with some caution, since the anecdote survives mainly through later, sometimes satirical, retellings, but the broader pattern it describes, an aggressive, state-sponsored effort to acquire every text the Ptolemaic court could get its hands on, fits everything else known about how the library grew. This was not a passive institution waiting for donations. It was an extension of royal policy, backed by the same administrative machine that collected taxes and managed the grain trade, and it treated the accumulation of texts as a form of prestige competition with rival Hellenistic kingdoms, chiefly the Attalid dynasty at Pergamon, which was building its own substantial library at roughly the same time. Under Ptolemy III Euergetes, who rules from 246 to 222 BC, the acquisitions drive intensifies further. A story recorded by later ancient writers, again to be treated as a colour anecdote rather than verified fact in its specific numbers, holds that Ptolemy III borrowed the official Athenian state copies of the great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, posting an enormous cash deposit as security for their return, then simply kept the originals, sending back copies and forfeiting the deposit rather than give up the genuine texts. Whether or not the details are precisely accurate, the story captures how the Ptolemaic court itself wanted to be remembered, as a power for whom no expense, financial or diplomatic, was too great in the pursuit of textual completeness. It is also under Ptolemy III that the library's physical footprint expands beyond its original quarters. A second, smaller collection is established at the Serapeum, the great temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis, a deity the Ptolemies had promoted partly as a unifying figure between Greek and Egyptian religious traditions. This daughter library, sometimes called the Serapeum Library in modern accounts, will matter enormously later in this story, since it survives, in various forms, long after the fate of the main Maurtian collection becomes uncertain, and its eventual destruction centuries later marks one of the clearest, best documented endpoints in the whole saga. For now, in the 3rd century BC, the Serapeum Library functions as an overflow site and a public-facing counterpart to the more restricted scholarly collection at the Maurtian, accessible, by most accounts, to a somewhat broader public than the inner research collection, reserved for the resident scholars. The harbour policy, the diplomatic gambits, the daughter library, all of it points toward the same underlying fact about how Alexandria's collection reached its extraordinary size. It was not built by patient donation or slow organic growth the way a modern research library might be. It was built by a state treating textual acquisition as an instrument of power, willing to bend rules, forfeit deposits and inconvenience foreign captains, because the prestige of holding everything mattered, enough to be worth the cost and the occasional diplomatic friction it caused with the very Greek cities the Ptolemies claimed to be honouring by preserving their literature. A scribe kneels beside a wooden shelving unit in a long gallery, tying a small papyrus tag to the protruding end of a scroll, a strip barely wider than 2 fingers that carries the work's title, its author's name and a short note on its length, so that a scholar scanning the shelf can identify a text without unrolling it. This little tag, called a syllabos in Greek, is a small invention with an outsized consequence. It makes it possible, for the first time on this scale, to browse a collection of hundreds of thousands of scrolls without physically handling each one, and it is only the first layer of a much larger organisational project undertaken at Alexandria in the middle of the 3rd century BC. The scholar most closely associated with that larger project is Callimachus, a poet from Cyrene who spends much of his career working at the library without ever holding the formal title of chief librarian, a position historians believe he did not occupy, though sources disagree on the point. What Callimachus does produce, in a work whose original text is now lost but whose existence and general structure are attested by later writers who used it, is the Pinakes, a title usually translated as tables or lists, an ambitious catalogue of the library's holdings organised by genre and by author, complete with short biographical notes and, where relevant, the number of lines a given work contained. This is not simply an inventory. It is an act of scholarship in its own right, since deciding how to classify a work, which genre it belongs to, whether a disputed text was genuinely written by the author it was attributed to, requires the same kind of critical judgment Callimachus and his colleagues apply to editing individual texts. The scale of the challenge should not be underestimated. Ancient book production had no equivalent of a publisher's imprint or a standardized title page. A given work of Greek literature might circulate under several different titles, in versions that varied significantly from copy to copy due to centuries of hand copying by scribes of uneven skill, and sometimes falsely attributed to a more famous author than the one who actually wrote it, since a text carrying a famous name was worth more and easier to sell. Sorting through this tangle, deciding which version of a play by Euripides was closest to what Euripides actually wrote, deciding whether a poem attributed to Homer was genuinely ancient or a later forgery, became one of the library's central intellectual occupations, distinct from but closely related to the acquisitions drive described in the previous chapter. Callimachus is far from alone in this work. Xenodotus of Ephesus, working slightly earlier in the 3rd century BC, and traditionally credited as the library's first chief librarian, undertakes one of the earliest large-scale editions of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, comparing multiple manuscript copies against one another to produce a single edited text, marking lines he suspected were later insertions rather than authentic, a method that anticipates, in a rough and early form, techniques modern textual scholars still use when reconstructing ancient works from imperfect surviving copies. This cataloguing and editing work matters for reasons well beyond 3rd century Alexandria's own convenience. Many of the editorial decisions made by Xenodotus, Callimachus, and their successors shaped the versions of Greek literature that survived antiquity and were eventually copied into the medieval manuscripts modern readers rely on. In a very concrete sense, when a reader today opens a modern printed edition of the Iliad, several editorial choices embedded in that text trace back through an unbroken chain of copying to decisions made by scholars working in these rooms, tying small tags onto scroll ends more than 2,200 years ago. A scholar stands beside a vertical rod planted in the ground at Alexandria at exactly midday on the summer solstice, measuring the short shadow it casts, while a report reaches him describing a well far to the south, at the city of Syene near modern Aswan, where on the same day the sun shines straight down the well's shaft and casts no shadow at the bottom at all. From this comparison, sometime in the later 3rd century BC, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who serves as chief librarian at Alexandria for several decades, produces one of the most celebrated calculations of the ancient world, an estimate of the Earth's total circumference derived from geometry alone. Using the angle of the shadow at Alexandria, the known distance between the two cities, and the assumption, itself a significant intellectual commitment for the period, that the Earth is a sphere and that the sun's rays reach it as effectively parallel lines. Historians today debate the precise units Eratosthenes used and therefore how accurate his final figure actually was in modern terms, since ancient distance measurements varied by region and by which specific stadion, a Greek unit of length, he was using, but by most accounts his result landed within a range that historians consider remarkably close to the Earth's true circumference, an extraordinary achievement using instruments no more sophisticated than a rod, a shadow, and a caravan's estimate of overland distance. Eratosthenes is a useful figure for understanding what the library made possible, because his calculation depended on more than personal cleverness. It depended on institutional infrastructure, reliable travel reports and administrative records describing distances between Egyptian cities, access to earlier Greek geographical and astronomical writing preserved in the library's collection, and colleagues to check his reasoning against, all concentrated in one place in a way no travelling scholar working alone could easily replicate. He does not stop at measuring the Earth. Eratosthenes produces a broader treatise on geography, attempting to map the known world with a grid of latitude and longitude lines, and he writes on chronology, trying to establish a reliable timeline of events stretching back to the fall of Troy. His contemporaries and successors at Alexandria pursue parallel questions with similarly striking results. Aristarchus of Samos, active earlier in the 3rd century BC, and associated with the broader Alexandrian scientific tradition, though the exact nature of his ties to the library itself is debated among historians, proposes that the Earth orbits the Sun rather than the reverse, a heliocentric model roughly 1,800 years before Copernicus revives the idea in early modern Europe. The proposal does not win over most ancient astronomers, who by most accounts find a stationary Earth easier to reconcile with observed stellar motion and with prevailing physical theory. And Aristarchus' model remains a minority position for the rest of antiquity, but its mere existence, preserved for later readers mainly through a brief mention in a work by Archimedes, demonstrates the range of ideas circulating in and around Alexandria's scholarly community during this period. What ties Eratosthenes and Aristarchus together, beyond working in roughly the same city during roughly the same century, is the underlying method their work shares with the cataloguing project described in the previous chapter. Careful measurement, systematic comparison of available evidence, and a willingness to trust geometry and observation over inherited assumption when the two conflicted. This is the intellectual culture the Ptolemaic endowment paid for, whether or not any individual king particularly cared about the shape of the Earth. What the money bought was time, freedom from other obligations, colleagues to argue with, and a collection of prior written work large enough that a scholar could check his reasoning against nearly everything anyone before him had already tried. A delegation of scholars is said to have arrived at Alexandria from Jerusalem by sea, sent at the request of the Ptolemaic court to undertake a task no one had attempted at this scale before, translating the sacred texts of the Jewish tradition, written in Hebrew, into Greek, the language of Alexandria's court, its administration, and its enormous and long-established Jewish community, one of the largest Jewish communities anywhere in the ancient world outside Judea itself. This is the origin story, as later tradition tells it, of the translation that comes to be called the Septuagint, a name derived from the Latin for 70, referring to the tradition that 70 or 72 scholars completed the work. Historians today treat the specific number and the more elaborate details of the story, recorded in a work called the Letter of Aristeas, written some generations after the events it describes, with real skepticism regarding its precise accuracy, while accepting the broader outline as plausible, that a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, beginning with the 5 books of the Torah, was produced at Alexandria sometime in the 3rd century BC, quite possibly with some form of royal encouragement, and that the translation of the remaining Hebrew scriptures followed over subsequent generations rather than being completed all at once. Whatever its precise origin, the practical significance of the Septuagint for the wider ancient world is difficult to overstate. Greek-speaking Jewish communities scattered across the Mediterranean, many of whose members no longer read Hebrew fluently, gain access to their own scriptural tradition in the dominant literary language of the region. Centuries later, early Christian communities, writing and worshipping largely in Greek, use the Septuagint as their primary version of what they come to call the Old Testament, meaning that a translation project connected to Alexandria's scholarly culture ends up shaping the scriptural basis of a religious tradition that will eventually spread across the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. The Septuagint project also illustrates something important about how Alexandria's intellectual culture actually worked, distinct from the more purely secular image of Greek philosophy and science that dominates modern popular memory of the library. Alexandria under the Ptolemies was a genuinely cosmopolitan city, home to substantial Greek, Egyptian and Jewish populations living in defined but interacting quarters, and its scholarly institutions, whatever their formal Greek framing as a shrine to Greek muses, drew on and produced work relevant to multiple religious and linguistic traditions simultaneously. Egyptian priestly scholarship, particularly around astronomy, chronology and religious ritual, circulated in Alexandria's intellectual circles alongside Greek philosophy, even if the balance of surviving evidence makes the Greek contribution look disproportionately dominant to modern readers working mainly from what survived. This cosmopolitan quality did not always produce harmony. Tensions between Alexandria's Greek, Egyptian and Jewish communities recur throughout the city's history, under both the Ptolemies and later the Romans, occasionally erupting into serious violence, and later chapters in this story return to specific episodes of intercommunal conflict that damaged the city and its institutions directly. But in the 3rd century BC, at least as far as the historical record allows a clear view, the translation project that produces the Septuagint stands as a striking example of the kind of cross-cultural intellectual labour Alexandria's concentration of scholars, patrons, and texts made possible, one whose consequences would ripple through the history of religion in the Mediterranean world for the rest of antiquity. In a room set aside for medical research within Alexandria's scholarly quarter, a physician traces the path of a nerve from the base of the skull down through the neck, distinguishing it for the first time from the blood vessels running alongside it, a distinction that sounds obvious to a modern reader, but that no earlier Greek physician had established with this precision. The physician is Herophilus of Chalcedon, working in Alexandria in the early 3rd century BC, and by most accounts his research draws on a resource almost no other Greek medical tradition had comparable access to, permission, evidently granted under royal Ptolemaic sponsorship, to dissect human cadavers systematically for anatomical study, a practice that Greek religious and social custom generally discouraged elsewhere in the ancient world. Ancient sources, particularly hostile later writers, go further and allege that Herophilus and his younger contemporary Erasistratus of Ceos performed vivisection on condemned criminals supplied by the Ptolemaic state, cutting into living bodies rather than only the dead. Historians today treat this specific and disturbing allegation with considerable caution, since it appears mainly in polemical sources written by later critics with their own reasons to paint the school in the worst possible light, but the underlying and better attested fact that Ptolemaic Alexandria permitted human dissection at a scale unmatched elsewhere in the Greek world is itself remarkable and helps explain the genuine advances the two men achieved. Herophilus distinguishes arteries from veins, describes the structure of the brain in far greater anatomical detail than his predecessors, correctly identifies the brain rather than the heart as the seat of the nervous system and intelligence, against the older view associated with Aristotle that had located reasoning in the heart, and produces detailed descriptions of the eye, the liver, and the reproductive organs based on direct observation. Eratosthenes, working in roughly the same period, investigates the heart structure and function, describing its valves and proposing, incorrectly by modern understanding but through a serious attempt at a mechanical explanation, a system for how blood and a vital substance he called pneuma moved through the vessels, an early and influential wrong turn in a debate about circulation that would not be properly resolved until William Harvey nearly 900 years later. This medical research sits alongside the astronomical work discussed in the previous chapter, as part of the same broader Alexandrian pattern: direct observation, systematic comparison, and a willingness to overturn inherited authority, whether the authority in question was Homer's text, Aristotle's physiology, or a stationary earth. The library and the Mauschen made this pattern possible, not because every scholar working there focused on the same subject, but because the institution concentrated resources, freedom from other work, and intellectual peers in one place, at a scale that let a physician's anatomical findings inform a mathematician's model of the body's proportions, and let an astronomer's geometric methods migrate into geography and cartography, in ways that scattered, isolated scholars working alone in separate cities rarely achieved. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine 3rd century Alexandria as free from constraint or controversy in the way a modern research institution might strive to be. The scholars competed fiercely for royal favour, and the funding that came with it criticised one another's work in terms that could be personal and cutting, and remained ultimately dependent on the goodwill of a royal dynasty that, as the following chapters show, would not remain stable, wealthy, or intellectually curious forever. The freedom to dissect a body, measure a shadow, or edit a disputed line of Homer was a privilege granted by kings, and privileges granted by kings can be withdrawn by kings, or by their less capable successors. A scholar reads aloud a disputed line from the Iliad to a room of colleagues, then marks the margin of his working copy with a small horizontal stroke, a critical sign indicating he believes the line was not part of the original poem, but a later addition by a copyist or an over-enthusiastic performer trying to pad a favourite scene. This kind of marginal notation, developed and refined across several generations of scholars, at Alexandria beginning with Xenodotus and continuing through Aristophanes of Byzantium, and later Aristarchus of Samothrace, who is not to be confused with the earlier astronomer Aristarchus of Samos discussed previously, represents one of the library's most durable intellectual legacies. A genuinely systematic method for evaluating which version of an ancient text, among several conflicting manuscript copies, most likely represented what the original author actually wrote. This mattered enormously for a practical reason. Works as fundamental to Greek identity as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey had circulated for centuries before reaching Alexandria's shelves, copied and recopied by scribes across the Greek world with no central authority enforcing consistency, performed aloud by professional reciters who sometimes altered lines to suit an audience, and occasionally padded or trimmed by later editors with their own agendas. By the 3rd century BC, no two manuscript copies of the Iliad circulating in the Greek world necessarily agreed on every line, and a scholar trying to comment seriously on the poem's meaning first had to decide which version of a contested passage he was even commenting on. Aristophanes of Byzantium, who serves as a senior scholar at Alexandria in the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BC, develops a more refined set of critical symbols than his predecessor Xenodotus had used, distinguishing several different types of textual problems: a line suspected of being spurious, a line suspected of being displaced from its proper position, a passage whose wording seemed corrupted through repeated copying, and he applies this system not only to Homer but to lyric poetry, comedy, and other genres, effectively founding the discipline of systematic textual criticism, as later scholars, ancient and modern alike, come to practice it. His student and eventual successor, Aristarchus of Samothrace, refines the method further, and produces what later ancient scholars regarded as the single most authoritative edition of Homer's poems to emerge from the library's long tradition of Homeric scholarship, an edition whose specific readings can still be partially reconstructed today from quotations and commentary preserved in later manuscripts, even though the edition itself, like almost the entire library collection, has not survived directly. This editorial tradition extends well beyond Homer. Alexandrian scholars produce critical editions and commentaries on the major Athenian tragedians, on the comic playwright Aristophanes, on the lyric poets Pindar and Sappho, and on a wide range of prose authors, effectively determining which version of a given classical Greek text would be copied forward into later antiquity, and, eventually, into the medieval manuscript tradition that preserved Greek literature for the modern world. When a modern classicist debates whether a particular line of Sophocles is authentic, or a later scribal insertion, the debate is, in a real sense, a continuation of arguments these Alexandrian editors were already having more than 2,000 years ago, using methods their institution helped invent. This work depended entirely on the specific conditions the library and Maution provided. A large, comparable body of manuscript copies gathered in one place through the acquisitions drive discussed earlier, a community of scholars trained to compare and argue over readings, and enough institutional stability, funding and continuity across generations for one scholar's work to be picked up, refined and extended by his successor rather than lost or forgotten. That continuity, taken for granted through the 3rd century BC, was about to come under serious strain. A group of scholars boards a ship at Alexandria's harbour, not to acquire books for the library this time, but to leave the city for good, seeking safer and more stable royal patronage elsewhere at courts that a generation earlier would have struggled to compete with what Alexandria offered. This exodus, occurring in fits and starts across the 2nd century BC, and intensifying sharply under the reign of Ptolemy VIII, sometimes called Physcon, who rules with interruptions between roughly 170 and 116 BC, marks the first clear turning point in the library's long decline, and it has less to do with any single catastrophic event than with a broader pattern of dynastic dysfunction that undermines the conditions scholarship at Alexandria had always depended on. The Ptolemaic dynasty by this period is in serious trouble, riven by repeated civil wars between rival claimants to the throne, often siblings or half-siblings married to one another in the Ptolemaic custom of dynastic intermarriage, a practice that consolidates royal legitimacy in theory but produces bitter personal rivalries in practice. Ptolemy VIII's own reign includes a documented episode, reported by the later ancient historian Athenaeus among others, in which political purges targeting perceived enemies at court extend to intellectuals associated with the Maution, with sources describing scholars being expelled from Alexandria, or fleeing voluntarily rather than risk the king's suspicion, since a royal court engaged in violent internal power struggles has little patience for philosophers whose loyalty seems uncertain. The specific numbers and names involved in this exodus are not fully reliable across the surviving sources, and historians treat individual anecdotes with appropriate caution, but the broader consequence is well attested. A meaningful transfer of scholarly talent and prestige away from Alexandria toward rival centres, chiefly Pergamon in Asia Minor, where the Attalid dynasty had been building its own substantial library for generations specifically to compete with Alexandria's reputation, and Rhodes, which develops its own significant tradition in rhetoric and philosophy during this same period, partly by absorbing talent that Alexandria's instability pushes outward. This does not mean the library at Alexandria ceases to function in the 2nd century BC. It remains by most accounts a major centre of scholarship for generations afterward, and individual scholars continue producing significant work there. But the unquestioned primacy Alexandria had enjoyed in the 3rd century BC, when it could simply outspend and outrecruit every rival court in the Greek world, is no longer secure, and the underlying reason points to something structurally important about how the whole institution worked from its founding onward. The Maution and library were never independent of the Ptolemaic crown in the way a modern university might be independent of any single government. They were funded directly from royal revenue, staffed at royal pleasure, and their scholars held their positions, their housing, and their tax exemptions because a king chose to grant them, not because of any independent endowment or institutional charter that could survive a hostile or indifferent ruler. When the dynasty was wealthy, ambitious, and relatively stable, as under the first 3 Ptolemies, this arrangement produced spectacular results. When the dynasty turned inward, consumed by civil war, assassination, and the kind of paranoid court politics that treats every prominent intellectual as a possible conspirator, the same total dependence on royal favour became a vulnerability with no institutional cushion to absorb it. This dependence would matter again, more dramatically, within the following century, when a foreign generals' war reaches Alexandria's own harbour and, for the first time in the library's history, brings real fire close enough to its books to leave a permanent, if often exaggerated, mark on how the whole story would later be told. Smoke rises over the warehouse district near Alexandria's harbour in 48 BC, set alight by most ancient accounts on the orders of Julius Caesar himself, who has landed in Egypt pursuing his defeated rival Pompey, and finds himself along with a small Roman force effectively besieged inside the palace quarter by hostile Alexandrian troops loyal to factions opposed to the young queen Cleopatra VII, whose throne Caesar has chosen to support. Caesar's own account of the campaign, along with several later Roman historians writing decades or centuries afterward, describes setting fire to enemy ships in the harbour to prevent them falling into hostile hands, a fire that then spread, whether by accident, by the wind, or by the simple density of a crowded ancient port, into nearby warehouses along the docks. Several ancient writers, including the historian Cassius Dio and more explicitly the later writer Plutarch, connect this fire to the destruction of books, with Plutarch specifically stating that the fire destroyed the great library. This connection has become, in popular retelling across the centuries since, the single most famous moment in the library's entire history, often compressed into a simple and dramatic claim that Julius Caesar burned down the Library of Alexandria. Modern historians treat that compressed version with significant skepticism, for several converging reasons worth stating plainly. First, the ancient sources that mention the fire in connection with books are writing generations after the event, none of them eyewitnesses, and their accounts vary in both detail and emphasis, which is itself a warning sign for any specific historical claim. Second, and more importantly, later ancient writers, including the geographer and historian Strabo, who personally visited Alexandria roughly 2 decades after Caesar's campaign, describe the Mautian and its scholarly community as still very much active, which is difficult to reconcile with the total destruction of the main library only 20 years earlier. Third, the fire that Caesar's own account and the geography of the harbour district best support burned primarily warehouses and dockside storage near the harbour, an area that by some later accounts held book stock intended for export or overflow storage rather than necessarily the core Mautian collection itself, which most historians place somewhat further inland within the palace quarter, though the precise boundaries and relationship between these different storage sites are not fully settled among specialists. The most defensible position, and the one this account follows, is that the fire of 48 BC did real damage, likely destroying some quantity of books, probably including scrolls stored near the docks awaiting shipment or overflow from the main collection, but that it did not single-handedly destroy the Library of Alexandria as a functioning institution, which continued operating with documented scholarly activity for centuries afterward. The persistence of the simpler, more dramatic version in popular memory says something worth pausing on about how this whole story tends to get told and retold. A single vivid image, a Roman general's deliberate arson consuming the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world in one afternoon, makes for a more satisfying narrative than the messier reality of an institution that survived a serious partial setback in 48 BC only to be worn down over the following centuries by a slower and less dramatic combination of reduced funding, political neglect, and eventually outright religious conflict. Cleopatra herself, restored to her throne with Caesar's backing after this war, goes on to rule Egypt for more than 2 decades, and the relationship between her court and the scholarly institutions her ancestors had built, along with the political alliance with Rome that both saves and eventually dooms her kingdom, shapes the next chapter of this story directly. A shipment of scrolls, said in a later account by the Roman biographer Plutarch to number in the tens of thousands, is unloaded at the harbour in Alexandria, a gift, according to that tradition, from Mark Antony to Cleopatra, drawn from the rival library at Pergamon that the Attalid kings had spent drains building specifically to compete with Alexandria's own collection. Historians treat this specific anecdote, like several others surrounding the library's history, with a reasonable degree of caution regarding the exact figure and even the literal truth of the transfer, since Plutarch is writing more than a century after the events he describes, and no earlier source corroborates the specific number. But the story fits a pattern this whole history has already shown: political and romantic alliances at the highest levels of the Hellenistic, and, by this period, Roman world, expressed partly through the transfer or destruction of prestigious book collections. Whether or not this precise gift occurred exactly as described, it symbolizes something real about Cleopatra's own relationship to her dynasty's intellectual legacy. She reigns from 51 BC until her death in 30 BC as the last Ptolemaic monarch, and by most accounts she takes a genuine personal interest in scholarship, reportedly fluent in multiple languages including Egyptian, a linguistic achievement her predecessors on the throne had rarely bothered with, and associated in later tradition, though again with some caution about the reliability of specific claims, with continued patronage of scholars at Alexandria, even as her kingdom's political position grows increasingly precarious, squeezed between its own internal instability and the overwhelming and growing power of Rome. That precariousness reaches its endpoint in 31 BC, when the combined fleet of Cleopatra and Mark Antony is decisively defeated at the Battle of Actium off the coast of Greece by the forces of Octavian, the future Roman Emperor Augustus, and in the following year, 30 BC, Alexandria falls, Antony and Cleopatra both die by suicide, and Egypt is annexed as a Roman province, ending nearly 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule and with it, the specific royal dynasty that had built and sustained the library from its founding. This is a genuine hinge point in the institution's history, even though, as with the fire of 48 BC, it would be a mistake to treat it as an instant or dramatic destruction. Augustus and his successors do not simply abandon Alexandria's intellectual institutions. The Mausion continues to exist under Roman rule, and scholarship continues at Alexandria for at least another 2 centuries with documented continuity, but the underlying relationship between the institution and its ruling power changes in a way that matters enormously for everything that follows. Alexandria is no longer a sovereign kingdom's proud capital, competing on the world stage for prestige against rival Hellenistic dynasties through spectacular cultural investment. It is now a wealthy but subordinate provincial city within a much larger Roman Empire, whose centre of political and financial gravity lies elsewhere, in Rome itself, and whose emperors, while sometimes personally interested in Greek learning, do not have the same specific dynastic incentive the Ptolemies once had to make Alexandria's library the single greatest showcase of royal power and prestige in the Mediterranean world. Funding patterns shift accordingly, gradually rather than suddenly, and the following chapters trace how Roman-era Alexandria's scholars manage, for a remarkably long time, to keep serious intellectual work going under these changed and generally less generous conditions, even as the specific structures that had made the Ptolemaic library so extraordinary slowly erode. A visiting geographer walks through the covered colonnades of the Mausion complex around 20 BC, noting in the account he will later publish that the institution still maintains a dining hall for its resident scholars and a substantial common building, evidence, by most accounts among modern historians, that Alexandria's scholarly community survived the political upheaval of Roman annexation with real continuity rather than the abrupt end popular imagination sometimes assigns to this period. The geographer is Strabo, whose surviving description remains one of the most valuable pieces of direct evidence for how the Mausion actually functioned this late in its history, and his account makes clear that whatever damage the fire of 48 BC and the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty had done, an active, funded scholarly community persisted at Alexandria under the new Roman administration. Roman emperors, beginning with Augustus himself, generally continue at least some level of support for Alexandria's institutions, partly because Egypt remains an enormously valuable province, chiefly as the source of a large share of the grain that feeds the city of Rome itself, and a wealthy, stable provincial capital serves Roman administrative interests, even without the specific dynastic prestige motive that had driven Ptolemaic investment. Scholarship at Alexandria under Roman rule does not simply coast on Ptolemaic-era momentum. Didymus Chalcenterus, working in the 1st century BC, earns his nickname, which means brazen gut or bronze innards in Greek, for the almost unbelievable volume of scholarly writing. Later tradition credits him with producing commentaries and compilations on Homer, on Athenian oratory, on lyric poetry, and on a wide range of other subjects, running by some ancient estimates into thousands of individual scrolls of output across his career, a figure modern historians treat as likely exaggerated, but that nonetheless signals a scholar working within an institutional tradition still capable of supporting sustained, large-scale intellectual production. Alexandria in the early Roman imperial period also remains a significant centre for medicine. Building on the anatomical tradition established by Herophilus and Eratosthenes centuries earlier, and it continues to attract students and physicians from across the Mediterranean world who come specifically to study there, a pattern that persists with fluctuating intensity well into the later Roman period. At the same time, the character of the city and its intellectual institutions is shifting in ways that will matter increasingly as this story moves forward. Alexandria's population includes large and sometimes tense Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish communities, and the historical record for the early Roman period includes several serious outbreaks of intercommunal violence, particularly between the city's Greek and Jewish populations, disputes over civic rights, taxation, and religious practice that occasionally spill into open rioting, and that the Roman administration, less personally invested in Alexandria's internal cultural politics than the Ptolemaic kings had been, does not always manage with great success or sensitivity. These tensions matter for the library's story, not because any specific riot in this early period is documented as damaging the collection directly, but because they establish a recurring pattern of civic instability in Alexandria that will, in later centuries, combine with religious transformation to produce far more serious and better documented damage to the city's scholarly institutions. For now, in the first century of Roman rule, the picture that emerges from sources like Strabo and from the record of scholars like Didymus is one of real continuity, diminished from the Ptolemaic peak in terms of royal glamour and perhaps in the sheer scale of new acquisitions, but still a functioning, respected, and productive centre of Greek learning, its lamps, by every indication available in the sources, still burning most nights. Roman legions under the Emperor Aurelian push street by street through Alexandria's royal quarter, the Bruchium, in a siege dated by most historians to around 272 AD, fighting to retake the city after it had fallen, amid the chaos of the broader Roman imperial crisis of the 3rd century, into the hands of forces loyal to Zenobia, the ambitious queen of Palmyra who had carved out a breakaway empire across Syria and Egypt, while Rome's central authority weakened under repeated civil wars, plague, and pressure on multiple frontiers simultaneously. The fighting in Alexandria during this siege is described by ancient sources, chiefly the later historian Ammianus Marcellinus and other fragmentary accounts, as unusually destructive even by the standards of a city that had already seen intercommunal rioting on several occasions in the preceding centuries, and the Bruchium Quarter, the same royal district that had housed the original Mausion and its associated buildings since the earliest Ptolemaic period, suffered severe, and by most accounts largely irreversible damage. Historians debate the precise state of the Mausion and its collection by this point in the 3rd century AD, since the documentary trail describing the institution's day-to-day activity, plentiful for the Ptolemaic and early Roman periods, thins out considerably by this stage, making it genuinely difficult to say with confidence how much of the original scholarly collection and community still existed in any organised form immediately before Aurelian's siege. What is reasonably well supported, though, is the broader picture. Whatever remained of the central Mausion complex by the 270s AD does not appear to survive this episode of urban warfare in any recognisable institutional form, and later ancient references to Alexandria's scholarly life after this point focus increasingly on the Serapeum, the temple complex and its daughter library, rather than on the original Mausion site, suggesting a real shift in where Alexandria's surviving intellectual activity was actually centred by the 4th century AD. This shift matters enormously for the rest of this story, because it means that by the time the historical record becomes vivid and detailed again in the late 4th century, the institution modern popular memory usually calls the Library of Alexandria is best understood not as a single continuous building, surviving from Ptolemy I's original foundation, but as a scholarly tradition that had already migrated, been damaged, rebuilt in diminished form, and relocated in emphasis at least once, probably several times, across 5 centuries of political upheaval, before the events that most popular retellings treat as its final destruction. The pattern established across this chapter and the 2 preceding it, the fire of 48 BC, the diminished but real continuity under early Roman rule, and now the urban warfare of Aurelian's siege should make one thing clear about how institutions like this actually end. There was no single moment when a Ptolemaic-era library, fully intact and unchanged since the 3rd century BC, was suddenly destroyed. What existed instead was a long, uneven process of damage, adaptation, and gradual relocation of activity, punctuated by several serious blows of varying severity, each of which reduced what survived a little further and made the whole enterprise a little more fragile heading into the next crisis. The next and, in most traditional tellings, the most decisive of those crises arrives roughly a century later, and it involves not a foreign general's war or a rival queen's revolt, but a transformation within Alexandria's own religious life. A mob gathers outside the walls of the Serapeum, the great temple to the god Serapis that has stood at the centre of Alexandria's religious and, by this point, its remaining scholarly life for nearly 6 centuries. In the year 391 AD, following an edict from the Roman Emperor Theodosius I banning pagan sacrifice and ordering the closure of pagan temples across the empire, Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria, the city's Christian patriarch, leads the effort to enforce this edict against the Serapeum specifically, a complex that by this period functions as the last major visible symbol of traditional Greco-Egyptian religious and intellectual life, in a city whose population, over the preceding generations, has shifted decisively toward Christianity, both through genuine conversion and through the mounting social, legal, and economic pressure an increasingly Christian Roman state applies against remaining pagan institutions. What happens next is described by several contemporary and near-contemporary sources, pagan and Christian alike, with broadly consistent details, even though their sympathies differ sharply. A period of serious civil unrest and street fighting between Alexandria's Christian population and a smaller group of pagan holdouts who barricade themselves inside the Serapeum complex, followed by the temple's destruction on Theophilus' orders, and with what several sources describe as explicit imperial sanction, its statue of Serapis smashed, and its buildings largely torn down or repurposed, with a church eventually built on part of the site. The daughter library housed within or near the Serapeum complex, the collection established back in the 3rd century BC under Ptolemy III, does not survive this episode in any organised form that later sources describe, and this event, more than the fire of 48 BC that popular memory usually credits, represents the clearest, best documented single moment of deliberate, large-scale destruction affecting an institution directly descended from the original Ptolemaic library project. It is worth being precise, though, about what exactly ended here, because the common shorthand, that this was the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, conflates several centuries of institutional history that this account has tried to keep distinct. By 391 AD, the original Maution founded by Ptolemy I had likely not existed in its Ptolemaic form for well over a century, badly damaged by Aurelian's siege in the 270s AD, and never fully restored in the same location or scale. What the destruction of the Serapeum ends is the last major institutional descendant of that original project, still holding a significant collection of texts under something like continuous scholarly use, and its ending is entangled, in ways contemporary observers on both sides clearly understood, with the much larger religious transformation of the Roman world from a plural, if often intolerant, patchwork of traditional cults into an empire actively enforcing Christian religious uniformity. One figure connects this episode directly to the story's final chapter. Theon of Alexandria, a mathematician and astronomer working in the city during this same period, in the final decades of the 4th century AD, continues producing scholarly commentaries and editions of earlier mathematical and astronomical works, including editions of Euclid's geometry that remain influential for centuries afterward, evidence that some form of organized intellectual activity persists in Alexandria even through and after the Serapeum's destruction, though clearly operating on a smaller, more precarious footing than the institution had ever known before. Theon has a daughter, trained in mathematics and philosophy under his instruction, whose own career and eventual fate, a generation after the Serapeum burns, will come to symbolize, for many later readers, the entire arc this story has been tracing from Ptolemy I's founding ambition down to its final painful unraveling. A woman walking through the streets of Alexandria in March of 415 AD is pulled from her chariot by a crowd, dragged to a nearby church, and killed in an act of mob violence that ancient sources attribute to rising tension between the city's Christian religious authorities, led at the time by Bishop Cyril, and the city's civil governor, a conflict in which the victim, a respected philosopher and mathematician named Hypatia, becomes a target seemingly because of her prominent public role as a teacher and advisor, with connections across the city's remaining pagan and philosophically minded elite, connections that made her, in the eyes of a mob whipped into anger by rumour and factional politics, a symbol of the old order some in the city wanted violently erased. Hypatia is the daughter of Theon, the mathematician and astronomer whose work was described in the previous chapter, and she had been trained by him from a young age in mathematics, astronomy and philosophy, going on to become by most accounts the most prominent teacher of Neoplatonist philosophy in Alexandria. In her own generation, attracting students from across the Eastern Mediterranean, regardless of their own religious background, since Neoplatonism at this period was not exclusively a pagan school of thought and had adherents among educated Christians as well. None of her own philosophical or mathematical writings survive directly, a loss historians attribute to the general pattern of ancient text transmission rather than to any specific act of destruction targeting her work in particular. Though what little is known of her contributions, largely through the writings of students and later commentators, suggests significant work on mathematical commentary and possibly on astronomical instrumentation. Her death, brutal and public, has become, across many centuries of later retelling, the single most widely recognized human symbol of the Library of Alexandria's ending, even though, as this whole account has tried to make clear, the actual institutional decline she stands in for had already unfolded gradually across nearly 5 centuries before her death, through dynastic collapse, a harbour fire, urban warfare, and the deliberate destruction of the Serapeum a generation earlier, none of which she personally witnessed as a direct participant, since she would have been a small child or not yet born at the time of the Serapeum's destruction. What her death does mark accurately, whatever the historical imprecision in treating it as a single clean ending point, is something real about the state of intellectual life in Alexandria by the early 5th century AD, a city where philosophical teaching outside explicitly Christian institutional structures had become genuinely dangerous, where mob violence against a prominent scholar could occur without decisive punishment of those responsible, and where the kind of royally funded, religiously plural, internationally staffed scholarly community that Ptolemy I and Demetrius of Phalerum had imagined nearly 750 years earlier had no remaining equivalent anywhere in the city. Organised learning does not vanish from Alexandria overnight, even after Hypatia's death. Teaching in mathematics, medicine and philosophy continues in the city for generations. Afterward, under different institutional forms and increasingly Christian intellectual frameworks, and Alexandria remains an important centre of scholarship, particularly in medicine and Christian theology, well into the era of the early Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century AD, when a further wave of later, largely legendary stories about libraries being burned attaches itself to that conquest too, stories modern historians generally treat with the same skepticism applied earlier to the Caesar anecdote, for similar reasons of late, indirect, and inconsistent sourcing. What actually happened to the knowledge the original library once held was less a single ending than a long dispersal. Texts copied and recopied into new manuscripts across the Mediterranean and the Near East over the centuries, some preserved through Byzantine scholarly tradition, some through Arabic translation movements centered in Baghdad and elsewhere that specifically sought out Greek scientific and philosophical works in the 8th and 9th centuries AD, and some lost for good, their titles surviving only as entries in Callimachus' ancient catalogue or as quotations embedded in other authors' surviving work, tags still tied, in a manner of speaking, to scrolls that no longer exist to read. By the 5th century AD, the building Ptolemy I imagined no longer exists in any form its founders would recognise, and the scrolls it once held survive only as scattered copies, translations and quotations in other people's books, carried onward by monks and scholars who never set foot in Alexandria, and often did not know where the words had first been written down. No single villain and no single fire ended it. A dynasty stopped paying for it. An empire stopped protecting it. A city stopped agreeing on what learning was for. What outlasted all of that was smaller and stranger than a building. A habit, passed from hand to hand across centuries and borders, of writing a tag onto a scroll and setting it on a shelf where someone else might find it, of keeping a lamp burning a little past dark for one more line, one more measurement, one more correction to somebody else's mistake. The harbour at Alexandria still exists, ships still come and go, but no one searches them for books anymore, and if you walked along that shoreline today past the modern breakwater, past the new library built decades ago in its old name, you would not find a single lamp still burning from the rooms where it began. They went out one at a time, long before anyone agreed the last one had.